This is a private preview. We don't let people wander in here with diesel on their hands.
It's wrapped. I just want to speak to a specialist about this painting.
Security! Get this man out before he ruins the merchandise!
Ah, specialist. Do you hear this? The silver-haired man turns to the room. To the flutes of champagne and the catalogs and the 40 people in the preview gallery. And he raises his voice on purpose. The way you light a match on purpose. He's got something wrapped in a Times feed sack. And he wants a specialist. What is it? Friend Granddad's deer rifle? A coffee can of arrowheads? We're a fine art house. Not a flea market. The pawn shop's 2 miles back toward the interstate. By the truck stop, you no doubt drove that thing in from... My family's owned this a long time. I drove 4 hours. If you'd let somebody just times look... Daniel, there's a man here casing the preview. Came in off the street in barn clothes carrying a sack. I'd like him walked out before he gets that stink on a client. I'm not casing anything. I came to do business. My name is... I don't want your name. I want your back. Going through that door. Look at you. Look at your Times boots. There are people in this room who flew in from London to be here. And you tracked mud across a floor that's older than your whole bloodline. To gawk at things you'll never afford and can't begin to understand. You don't know my bloodline. Son, I know enough. I've done this 30 years. I can tell a buyer from a barn find walk-in before he's 3 steps through the door. And you, my friend, are not a buyer. Daniel and somebody check what he's already got in that sack. God knows what's gone missing off a plinth while we've all stood here being polite. Earl Crane does not raise his voice. That's the first thing the 40 people in that gallery will get wrong. When they tell it later, they'll remember a scene. A countryman hollering about his rights. There was none of that. There was a 67-year-old widower in clean Carhartt coveralls and a feed store cap he'd taken off the second he came indoors, holding a burlap-wrapped rectangle against his chest with 2 big, careful hands. Standing very still in the center of a room full of champagne, while a man in a 3-piece suit invited the whole room to laugh at his boots. And the room laughed. Not all of it, but enough. A woman in pearls near the Rothko that wasn't a Rothko gave a soft, amused exhale. A young man in a velvet jacket lifted his phone, grinning, and started filming sideways for the joke. Not for the record. Not yet. The security porter, a kid named Daniel Cho, 24, came across the parquet with his hands already half raised in apology. Because he could see the old man wasn't casing anything. But Hugh Marston had said Times walk him out. Times and Hugh Marston signed the schedules. Sir, Daniel said, low. I'm real sorry. I'm going to have to ask you to step outside. I understand. Earl said. He didn't step back. He didn't clutch the painting tighter. And he didn't shove it forward to prove anything either. He just looked at Hugh Marston, the way a man looks at weather, coming over a ridge without surprise. Having seen it before. And he said, quiet enough that the laughing people had to stop laughing to hear it. You ought to read the paper before you read the room. Hugh Marston's smile thinned. What did you say to me? It's something a man told me once. You've got it backwards is all. Earl set the wrapped painting down gently. Flat. On the runner of carpet. Not on any plinth. Not against any wall. Careful as setting down a sleeping child, and he straightened up with both empty hands, open at his sides. I'll go. I don't make scenes. My wife couldn't stand them. But you're going to be sorry about this one. Son. And not for the reason you think. Walk me out. Daniel. You're all right. Because here is what Hugh Marston did not know. What no one in that gallery knew. What the young man filming for a joke did not know. What would... Within 72 hours. turned the oldest auction house in the state inside out. The man he'd just had walked off the floor for the diesel on his hands owned the building. His name was on it. The Times Vane, Times in Thornbury, and Vane was his blood, his grandmother's name. The name they'd struck off the family Bible the year she married a hill farmer, and when the last city Vane died, childless, 2 winters ago. The controlling shares of a 153-year-old auction house had passed. Quietly. Through a trust and a startled estate lawyer. To a widower on a tobacco farm in Slate Hollow who had never once come to see the thing his blood built. Today he came to see it. He wore his work clothes on purpose. He wanted to know how the house treated a plain man before he told them who the plain man was. Now he knew. If you've ever been measured by your boots in a room your own people built, drop one word in the comments. We'll know what it means. Because what happens in the next 3 days, not one person holding a champagne flute in that gallery is ready for. Let me tell you about Earl Crane. And let me start where he'd start, which is not with the shares or the lawyers. It starts with his grandmother and a painting and a winter when the relief check didn't come. The Crane's farm, Slate Hollow. A fold in the mountains where the morning fog pools so thick you can't see the barn from the porch. And where Earl's grandmother, Eva, was born of Vane, the youngest daughter of the same Augustus Vane, who, in 1871, founded a little auction room in the city that grew over 150 years into Thornbury and Vane, with its marble lobby and its London clients and the painting in the place of honor by the front desk, The Hollow at Dusk, by the early American master Avery Cole, the cornerstone of the firm's reputation, valued in the last insurance assessment at $31 million. It's a painting of a mountain hollow at sunset. Earl could tell you the exact bend of creek in it. He stood in it. It's his hollow. It's Slate Hollow. Painted by Avery Cole in 1889 when he summered up there. And he painted 2 a pair. Sunrise and sunset. Dawn times and times, dusk times. And he gave the pair to the family that boarded him. The Cranes. The Hill people. Before they were anybody's poor relations. Here is what the firm's glossy provenance card by the painting says. The Hollow at Dusk. Acquired by the founder, Augustus Vane, in 1936. A cornerstone of the Thornbury and Vane collection. Here is what the provenance card does not say. It does not say that 1,936 was the worst winter of the Depression in Slate Hollow, or that Augustus Vane's daughter Iva had married a Crane against her father's wishes and been cut off without $1, struck out of the family Bible, told never to use the name Vane again. It does not say that by February of 1936, Iva Vane Crane was a widow with 3 children and no coal, and a baby with a cough that went down into his chest. In a house where you could see your breath over the stove. It does not say that her own father, her Times father Times, drove a heated car up the mountain in his good coat, looked at his grandchildren's blue lips, and offered his disowned daughter $40 for the pair of Avery Coles on her wall, knowing what they were, knowing she'd take it, because $40 was coal and a doctor and her baby's life. Iva took the $40. She kept the baby alive, and she did one thing her father didn't count on. She sold him Times Dusk, and she hid Times Dawn, Times the sunrise, the better of the two. Cole's own favorite under the floorboards of the smokehouse wrapped in a feed sack, because she would be damned before she'd hand a Vane every last beautiful thing she had. She kept the receipt, too, $40, in her father's own hand, for 2 paintings, Cole Times, except she'd folded it so the world would only ever see what he wrote under it. The thing she made him write before she'd sign, bought of the rural branch, The rural branch. That's what Augustus Vane called his own daughter and her freezing children on a legal receipt. The rural branch. It's the founding document of Thornbury and Vane. In a way the glossy card will never admit. The house's crown jewel and the start of its fortune came from cheating a Vane. The family had decided wasn't really a Vane anymore, because she'd married a man with dirt under his nails. Iva raised that baby. The baby grew up and had Earl. Iva kept Times Dawn, Times under the smokehouse floor, for 60 years, and showed it to Earl exactly once, when he was 12, and told him the whole thing, and made him promise 2 things: never sell it cheap, and never forget what they are. We're Vanes, too, she told him. We were Vanes when it was cold and they had the coal. Don't you ever let anybody in a nice coat tell you what you are. Earl kept the painting and the promise for 55 years. On a farm, married to a woman named Ruth, who knew the whole story and loved it. And 2 winters ago, a lawyer named Louis Ravel came up the mountain in a rented car, the first Vane lawyer up that road since 1936, to tell Earl that the last of the city, Vanes, had died with no children, and that the trust traced down every branch, including the one struck from the Bible, named Earl Crane, the majority shareholder of Thornbury and Vane. Earl didn't do a thing with it. He was burying Ruth that spring. She'd been sick a long time. He left the managers in place, signed where Ravel pointed, and went back to the farm. But the last thing Ruth said to him, near the end, was about the painting. Take Dawn home. Earl, take the pair back together. And go see what your people built, but go in your barn clothes first. And see how they treat a hill farmer before you tell them whose floor they're standing on. Iva would have wanted to know. So this morning Earl Crane wrapped Times the hollow at dawn, Times in a clean feed sack, the same kind his grandmother hid it in, put his grandmother's folded $40 receipt in the chest pocket of his coveralls, drove 4 hours down out of the fog, and walked into the house, his blood built to find out how it treats a plain man. He found out in about 90 seconds. Let's go back into that gallery. Slow this time, because there's a kid behind the front desk who is about to do the bravest thing in the building, and an old man by the coat room who's about to do the second bravest. The kid is Aoife Brennan, 26, a first-year junior specialist on a probationary contract that Hugh Marston renews, or doesn't, every March. She's the one who actually knows the catalog cold, who can date a frame by its joinery, who got hired out of a doctoral program and spends her days fetching coffee for men who can't tell a period reproduction from the real thing. She was at the desk when Earl came in. She heard Times barn clothes, Times and Times feed sack. And she watched the old man set his wrapped rectangle down on the carpet with a care. She recognized the way you handle something you know is fragile and old and real, and she watched the burlap fall open an inch, where the twine slipped, and Aoife Brennan saw, for 1 second, in the gap in the feed sack, a corner of a canvas, a sky going gold over a notch in a blue ridge. In a hand, she had spent 4 years of graduate school learning to recognize, next to a signature she could have drawn from memory. She came around the desk fast. Mr. Marston. Mr. Marston. Wait. Not now. Brennan. Sir, I need you to look at the painting before he... I said Times, not now. Daniel's handling it. Marston didn't even turn. Get back to the desk. Sir, please. Aoife's voice cracked up an octave, the way it does when you're 26 and on probation and trying to stop a moving train with your bare hands. I think that's a Times coal. I think the sky, the signature. It's the Times companion piece. It's the other one. It's Dawn. And for 1 second, 1 human second, Something behind Hugh Marston's eyes flickered. Because he is a snob in this story, and a small, cruel man in this story, but he is not, in the strict sense, an idiot. And the words times, companion piece times and times, coal times, landed in his chest wrong. Because the Lost Times Hollow at Dawn Times is the single most hunted American picture his house has chased for 80 years. The missing twin of the painting that built them. But Hugh Marston had performed Certainty in front of 40 people and a velvet-jacketed phone. And Hugh Marston's whole life is the unbroken belief that he can read a man's worth off his shoes. And to look at the painting now would be to admit that a graduate school girl on probation might know something he didn't. And that a hill farmer in diesel-stained Carhartts might be carrying $30 million in a feed sack. So he doubled down. That's the engine of this whole genre. And it's the engine here. A man who would rather be cruel than be wrong. It's a Mal barn-find daub. Brennan. The woods are full of them. Every hollow in this state has a fake. Coal. Some peddler sold great-grandpa. Get him times out. Daniel. And get back to your desk before I find someone who wants your job. And there are times 40 times someone's who want your job. He raised his voice for the room again. We do not authenticate truck stop merchandise. We are not a Times flea market. Daniel Cho put his hand on Earl Crane's shoulder. Earl rose, took up his wrapped painting, and let himself be steered toward the door. And from the coat room, an old man said, "That's not right. His name is Sal Petrie. He's 84. He started at Thornbury and Vane as a teenage porter in 1956 and retired as head of art handling in 2009 and still comes in 3 days a week because his wife's gone and the house is the only family he's got. And they let him stamp catalogs and tell the young handlers how to crate a calder. Sal Petrie has carried every important painting that's come through those doors for 68 years. And Sal Petrie was a boy of times, 8 times in the back of the truck in 1936, when Augustus Vane drove up to Slate Hollow and came back down with 2. No. With times 1, times Avery Cole, and a face like a man who'd done something he'd be paying for the rest of his life. And Sal had seen, through the truck's back window, the widow on the porch with 3 children, and the blue-lipped baby, and he had never, in 88 years, forgotten her face. He looked at Earl Crane being walked to the door, and he saw Iva Vane's jaw on a man 50 years too young to be her. And he stood up out of the coat room chair on his bad hip and said it louder. "That's not right. You leave that man be. He's got more right to stand on this floor than anybody holding a glass in this room. And I'll tell you why. If you, Sal, Cressida Bain Marston's head of client relations, 48, Precis. The woman who runs the floor, the way a sergeant runs a line, had a hand on the old porter's arm. Gentle and absolute. Sal, sweetheart, you've had a long morning. Let's get you some water. This doesn't concern you. I am the only one at times concern. Vater. Saul. And Sal Petrie. The man who has handled every masterpiece in that building for 68 years. The only living soul who watched the original sin get loaded into a truck. Was walked into the back office and given a paper cup. So that Hugh Marston could finish having a hill farmer removed from a floor. The hill farmer owned. Hold on to Sal. The world will. Outside. On the granite steps. Daniel Cho let go of Earl's shoulder and couldn't look at his face. For what it's worth, the kid said to the sidewalk. I don't think you were casing anything. I know you don't. Son. Earl tucked the painting under his arm and looked back up at the brass letters over the door. Thornbury and Vane. Est. 1,871, and at the gold lettering on the window. Connoisseurship. since the founding. And he almost smiled. Because times, connoisseurship times, was a $40 word for what they'd done to his grandmother. Then he reached into the chest pocket of his coveralls. Not for the receipt, but for an older kind of phone than anyone in that gallery owned. And he dialed 7 digits from memory. The call lasted 19 seconds. Lewis. It's Earl Crane. I'm standing outside the Thornbury and Vane City House. I'd like you to come down here. And I'd like you to bring the share register and whatever it is that proves who I am to people who don't want to believe it. App House. Bring the whole team. Yes. Today. He put the phone away. He sat down on the granite steps of the building he owned, in his barn clothes, with $30 million wrapped in a feed sack across his knees. And he waited in the sun. Inside, Hugh Marston was on his victory lap. He'd buttoned his jacket and was holding the room like a man giving a toast. This, he said, sweeping a hand at the door, is exactly why we have standards. Anyone can wrap a board in burlap and call it a coal. It takes 30 years of judgment to know the difference between a client and a A-time circumstance. You read the room. The room never lies. Cressida Bain was already updating the visitor log. Unidentified male. Removed. Possible attempted fraud. The velvet jacket young man was posting his video for a laugh. 11 seconds. Guy tried to sell a feed sack at Thornbury's LMAO. It had 400 views. Eve Brennan stood at the desk with her hands flat on the counter to keep them from shaking. Looking at the door. Knowing what she'd seen in the gap in the burlap. Knowing she'd be on the street by March for saying it out loud. And not. Somehow, sorry she'd said it. 14 minutes after Earl's call, 3 black cars came around the corner off the avenue and stopped in a line at the curb in front of the house. They didn't double park crooked. They didn't run lights. They came slow and exact and parked the way money parks. And the doors opened all at once. And out came Louis Ravel, senior partner of the firm that has administered the Vane Trust for 40 years, in a suit that cost more than Earl's truck, carrying a leather folio and a banker's box. Behind him, 2 more trust attorneys. A forensic art lawyer the firm kept on retainer, and a woman with a phone already to her ear who turned out to be the trust's communications counsel. Behind times them, moving slower, helped by a young clerk, came an old man Ravel had collected on the way in, but we'll get to him. Louis Ravel crossed the sidewalk to where his client sat on the steps in coveralls. And he did a thing that made 2 people on the street pull out their phones. He stopped, and he took off his own hat. And he said, "Mr. Crane, I'm sorry it took 14 minutes. And he helped a 67-year-old hill farmer to his feet like he was helping a king up off a throne. Then they went inside. Hugh Marston was still mid-toast when the brass door opened, and a hill farmer walked back in with a 4-lawyer wedge and a banker's box behind him. The room went quiet, the way a room goes quiet, when the temperature of it changes. Marston's mouth was still shaped around the word time standards. Cressida Bain's hands stopped over the keyboard. Aoife Brennan came up out of her chair. Earl Crane walked to the center of the gallery, the exact spot where he'd set the painting down, where Marston had pointed at his boots, and he set the feed sack down again. Gentle, flat, and Louis Ravel stepped up beside him, opened the leather folio, and laid a single document on the nearest plinth, on top of a Tang Dynasty horse worth more than the block Earl's farm sat on. My name is Louis Ravel. I'm senior partner at Ravel Hutch, administrators of the Vane Family Trust. His voice was not loud. It carried the way a closing door carries. This is the certified share register of Thornbury and Vane Holdings. As of 2 years ago, this March, 61% of the voting shares of this house are held in trust for a single individual. He looked up. The gentleman your director just had removed from the floor for the diesel on his hands. May I introduce the controlling owner of Thornbury and Vane? Mr. Earl times Vane times Crane, grandson of Iva Vane, whose name, I believe, is on the building. The silence after that had a floor and 4 walls. Hugh Marston's face went the color of old paper. He put a hand on the counter. There's been a misunderstanding, terrible. There's been no misunderstanding. Earl said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There's been a decision. You decided what I was by my boots. The second I came through that door. And you decided it loud. So the whole room could enjoy it. That's not a mistake. Son, a mistake is when you didn't mean it. You meant every word. Mister. Crane, mister. Vane per sir. If I'd times known. That's the part I want you to hear yourself say. Earl took a step toward him. And the step was worse than a shout. If you'd known I owned it. If you'd known I had 30 million in a feed sack. That's what's eating you. Not that you did it, but that you did it to the wrong man. You'd have done it to the Times. Right Times won all day long. You did it to 4 of them last year. Didn't you? You've got a whole drawer of right ones. Marston's mouth moved. Nothing came out. His knuckles were white on the edge of the counter. And then Earl did the thing he'd driven 4 hours and waited 55 years to do. He knelt down both knees. Slow. A farmer's knees. And he untied the twine on the feed sack. And he folded the burlap back. And he stood the painting up against the front of the counter where the whole room could see it. The hollow at dawn. A sky going gold over a notch in a blue ridge. Slate Hollow at Sunrise. By Avery Cole. 1889. The lost twin that the house Earl owned had chased for 80 years, sitting on the floor in a feed sack, 10 feet from its sister. The hollow at dusk, hanging in the place of honor by the door. The two of them looking at each other across a marble lobby for the first time since a man drove up a mountain in 1936 and split them apart over a baby's blue lips. Aoife Brennan made a small sound and put her hand over her mouth. Sal Petrie, who'd come back out of the office with Ravel's young clerk, stood in the doorway and started, silently, to cry. My grandmother sold your house the other one for $40. Earl said, into the quiet, to all of them. In February of 1936, because her own father drove up our mountain and offered her exactly enough to keep my daddy from freezing, and not $1 more, because he knew she'd take it. She kept this one under a smokehouse floor for 60 years, so you couldn't have the pair. And she kept the receipt. He took the soft folded square out of his chest pocket and held it up. And it had been folded so many times for 90 years, it moved like cloth. It's got his handwriting on it. You know what he wrote? What he called his own daughter and her freezing kids on a legal document? Earl unfolded it. Bought of the rural branch. The rural branch. That's where your crown jewel came from. Mr. Marston. That's where your fine old house came from. From doing to a vein in the cold exactly what you just did to me on this floor. You've been in business 153 years and you have times never stopped. Okay. I gotta stop here a second. Real talk, old man drove 4 hours. Got laughed at over his Times boots. Got his grandma's stolen painting called a truck stop daub. And he walks back in and owns the whole building. And the painting they robbed his family of is hanging Times right there by the door Times the whole time. I had to pause the video. I'm not even gonna lie. I rewound it 3 times. The video, the real one. Not the velvet jacket joke went up that night. Because the woman who'd been quietly filming since Times barn close, not for a laugh, was a stringer for an arts and culture site who'd come to cover the preview and got the whole 9 minutes instead. The boots. The feed sack. The rural branch. The lawyers. The share register. The two paintings finally facing each other across the marble. She uploaded 11 minutes of it at 9 p.m. By noon the next day, it had 2 million views. By midnight. 14. Number The Rural Branch trended for 3 days. People froze the frame on Hugh Marston's face going to paper. And on the gap in the burlap, and on Sal Petrie crying in the doorway. And on one line, which became a headline and then a banner at 3 different protests, outside 3 different auction houses in 3 different cities. You read the room. The room never lies. Said by a man who just read a $30 million painting as truck stop merchandise because the man holding it had dirt on his hands. Thornbury and Vane issued a statement at 11 a.m. It was 79 words long. The House is grateful to its clients and the public for their long-standing trust. Deeply regrets a miscommunication involving an unidentified visitor during a private preview. And remains, as it has for over a century, devoted to the connoisseurship and discretion our community expects. 79 words. No name. No apology to the person. It calls him times an unidentified visitor, times the man whose name is welded over the door. It does not say times our director had the controlling owner removed for his clothes. It does not use the words times barn clothes, or times hillbilly, or times the rural branch. It does not say times our most valuable painting was taken from a freezing widow for $40. The word times connoisseurship, times the firm's whole brand. The word in gold on the window appears once. In a sentence, apologizing for nothing. In a statement about a man they decided wasn't a connoisseur because of his boots. Earl Crane released nothing. He drove the 4 hours home and milked. Because cows don't care who owns an auction house. But the next evening, a one-line post went up on an account in his late wife's name, Ruth's, that had never posted before a photograph of 2 paintings, dawn and dusk, leaning side by side against a marble counter, and under it, in a farmer's blocky hand on a strip of tape, Iva Vane kept this one under the floor so they couldn't have the pair. They called her the Rural Branch. We were Vanes when it was cold. That post was shared too, 4 million times in 4 days. The withdrawals came like weather. The Marquis spring sale, the one the house had bet its whole year on, started bleeding consignments before lunch the next day. A West Coast collector pulled a Diebenkorn pending review of the house's practices. A museum that had been planning to deaccession through Thornbury and Vane paused the relationship. By 2 o'clock, the firm's largest institutional consignor, a foundation that had used the house for 30 years, withdrew its entire summer estate, sale 18 lots. Low estimate $90 million in a 1-paragraph letter that used the word times appalled. And then the part the house couldn't survive, the state's Consumer Protection Division, which has a financial fraud unit and a long memory, announced it was opening an inquiry not into the preview, into the Times practices. Because a reporter had handed them a thread, her name is Marisol Vega. And she spent a year on Thornbury and Vane for reasons that have nothing to do with a feed sack. Her tip came last spring. From a defrauded family in a mill town 2 hours north, a widow whose late husband's barn-find landscape the house had appraised at $4,000, bought outright through a middleman, and resold 90 days later, cleaned and reframed, for $310,000. The widow only found out because her granddaughter saw it in a catalog. There was no recourse. She'd signed. Marisol started pulling, and she found it wasn't one widow. It was a Times practice. It had a name inside the house, an unwritten one. the way the worst things always do. Marisol had the thread for a year and no way to make anyone care. A controlling owner getting called a hillbilly on 14 million screens made people care. And on the third day, the last person anyone expected walked into Marisol Vega's office with a banker's box. Margaret Holloway, 68. Head registrar of Thornbury and Vane for 40 years, the keeper of the Provenance files. The one person in the building who knows where every body is buried because she's the one made to bury them. Margaret had known about the 1,936 receipt for decades. It was in the locked Provenance file on Time's Dusk. The file only she and the directors could open. The file that said, in a 1971 internal note, acquisition circumstances sensitive. Provenance to read acquired 1,936 only. And Margaret had spent 40 years watching the modern version of 1,936 run on a quiet system. And she was retiring in the fall. And she could not carry it into retirement. Inside her box, the 1,936 file on Time's Dusk, including Iva Vane Crane's receipt, and the 1,971 note instructing staff to launder the provenance, and the modern rot, an internal consignor grading system. Never written into any policy, but coded into every client record. Clients flagged BF, Barn, Fine Times, or ME, Manage Expectations. Times were the ones the house had decided didn't know what they had. The grade triggered lowball appraisals. Fast outright purchases through middlemen instead of auction. And a quiet markup on resale. Margaret had the records. Over 9 years. 340 consignors carried a Times BF, Times, or Times ME, Times, flag. The pattern of who got flagged was not random. It tracked rural addresses, immigrant surnames, elderly sellers, estates with no lawyer. Marisol cross-referenced it against resale. The house had bought Times BF, ME, Times property for a documented total of $4. $1 million, and resold it for $39 million. $35 million skimmed off people. The house had decided were too unsophisticated to rob. And the smoking gun. A short email Margaret had printed and kept. Sent by Hugh Marston to Trevor Pyle. The house's outside counsel sent on the Times' second day. After the video. After the share register. After Marston knew Times exactly Times who Earl Crane was. The body. In full. Is greater than. I don't care that his name is on the building. He came in here in barn clothes, reeking of diesel, and the optics of pretending a hill farmer is our chairman are worse than the video clients. Do not want their Vermeers handled by a man who smells of a tractor. Do not authenticate the Crane receipt. The Dusk provenance is the single most valuable thing this house owns. And a sob story about a frozen widow in 1936 does not survive contact with the brand. The BF ME desk is sound commercial practice and entirely defensible. We buy low from people who don't know what they have. That is the entire business. Always has been. Keep it a misunderstanding with an unidentified visitor. He stays a trespasser in the record. And, that is the entire business. Always has been. Not a heat-of-the-moment slip on a gallery floor. A typed confession on the second day, after he knew the man owned the house, that the house's whole fortune from 1,936 to last Tuesday is built on buying low from people it has decided are too poor and too plain to know better, and that the contempt on the floor and the contempt in the provenance file and the contempt in the Times BF Times flag are all one contempt. 153 years long. That only ever stayed off the record because Margaret Holloway kept being told to file it away. Marisol Vega verified every page in 6 hours. She published on the third night. The headline, "That is the entire business. Always has been. How Thornbury and Vane built a fortune, robbing the people it called the rural branch." The piece ran 500 words. It ran the 1,936 receipt beside the Modern Times, BF Times, spreadsheet, a frozen widow, and 340 more, 90 years apart. The same flag. It ran Marston's email beside the 1,971 note, instructing staff to launder Times, Dusk's Times, Provenance, 2 men, 2 generations. The same order. Keep it off the record. It ran the photograph of the 2 paintings, finally facing each other. It named the Milltown widow whose coal became $310,000. And it told, for the first time anywhere in print, about a baby with blue lips and a grandmother who hid a sunrise under the smokehouse floor. By midnight, the site's servers crashed twice. The counterattack came, the way it always does. And it was as ugly as the genre promises. And it died fast. Because there was a receipt and a spreadsheet and 2 paintings in a room. Trevor Pyle, the House Counsel, fired off legal demands on the 4th day. A takedown against the Stringers video filmed at a private event. A warning to Marisol's site. And the centerpiece. A demand that Earl Crane cease representing himself as connected to the firm's management, pending resolution of contested governance questions, and that he produce the so-called 1,936 receipt and the unattributed painting for authentication by the firm's chosen examiner, that is, hand the proof of the theft and the stolen painting itself to the people with the most reason to make them vanish. They flipped it. The man they robbed becomes the one with contested standing. The house that skimmed $35 million becomes the aggrieved institution defending its brand. The fake accounts bloomed 11 of them. Earl Crane's a disgruntled relation after the money. The receipt's a forgery. Rural branch is too on the nose to be real. The forensic document examiner the trust retained dated the ink and the paper to the 1930s within the week. The handwriting matched Augustus Vane's signature on the firm's own founding charter. Times. The painting's a copy. The real Dawn was lost. Afa Brennan, it turned out, had photographed the gap in the burlap on instinct the morning of the preview. The canvas weave, the ground. The signature all matched Cole's documented technique. And a museum conservator confirmed it on the record. Times. He's exploiting his dead wife's account for sympathy. That one the internet handled itself. And then the smear reached the soft places. The way it does. It reached Aoife. The house's machine put it about that the junior specialist was unstable, had a grievance over her contract, was angling for attention. A girl on probation, 26, with student debt and a visa tied to her job. Got it from every direction, and went on the record anyway, with her photograph and her catalog notes, and did not take it back. And it reached Sal Petrie, a blogger sympathetic to the house, got to the 84-year-old and asked him, with oily gentleness, whether he was really certain, at his age, that he remembered a truck ride in 1936, or whether he might be an elderly gentleman who's grown confused and attached to a romantic story. Sal Petrie is 84. His voice on the phone did not shake. Young man, I was 8 years old in the back of that truck. I have carried crates for this house for 68 years every saison. Every coal, every calder that came through those doors went through these 2 hands. And in February of 1936, I watched Augustus Vane carry 1 painting down off a mountain and leave a widow and 3 blue children standing on a porch in the cold. And I have seen her face every single night of my life, since So you ask me, am I times confused? I am the least confused man you will ever telephone. The only thing I was ever confused about is why a great house could carry a Vermeer with white gloves and rob a freezing woman with the same hands. Now, is there anything else you'd like me to be too old to remember? The blogger hung up. He did not write the story. But Sal, after he hung up, didn't feel like he'd won. He sat in his apartment with a paper cup of tea and thought about 68 years of white gloves and how he'd known. The whole time. Where Times, Dusk Times, came from. And how he'd filed it under Times, not my place, Times the same way Margaret filed her paperwork. Under Times acquired 1,936. And how a man can spend his whole life being careful with the paintings and careless with the people. He asked the building super for a pen and wrote, in a hand gone shaky, Mr. Crane, I was in the truck in 1936. I saw your grandmother on the porch. I have carried this house's treasures for 68 years, and I never once said where the best one came from. I will say it now. Under oath. Anywhere. For as long as I last. I should have said it when she was still alive to hear it. Sal Petrie. He mailed it. Earl read it at the kitchen table in Slate Hollow and had to set it down and walk out to the barn for a while. It's the thing that decided him on what came next. That night, Earl sat alone at the table with Times Dawn, Times propped on a chair where Ruth used to sit. And he thought, for the first time, about just taking the painting home and selling the shares and letting the lawyers and the state do whatever they do, about whether dragging 153 years into the light was worth what it was costing a girl on a visa and an old man who'd carried crates his whole life. And his grandmother's voice came back to him from when he was 12. Her hand on the feed sack. Don't you ever let anybody in a nice coat tell you what you are? And don't you sell it cheap? Earl. Not the painting. Not any of it. This is the floor. From here it goes one way. The reckoning came at a shareholders' meeting. Earl Crane called himself, with 61% of the votes in his pocket, in the marble lobby of the house he owned. Under both paintings. With the press in the back and the state's consumer protection investigators in the second row, Louis Ravel laid out the proof in clean strokes, the share register. The 1,936 file. The laundered provenance note. The Times BF, ME Times spreadsheet. The resale numbers. The forensic dating of the receipt. And then he did the one thing that turns a story like this from a fight into a verdict. He put Hugh Marston's own email up on the screen. And he asked Hugh Marston to read it aloud. Marston stood in a gray suit, not charcoal, not three-piece, and read it. His voice held until Times a sob story about a frozen widow in 1936. And then it didn't. His hands shook on the single sheet of paper. That is the entire business. Always has been. He read his own sentence into a silent marble room with 2 stolen sunrises watching him. And when he finished, he didn't look up. Cressida Bain, the enforcer. Tried Pamela's move times. I only did what Mr. Marston directed. The grading desk. The flags. All of it came from him. Times and the fracture between them was instant and total. 20 years of partnership, gone in 2 sentences. And it didn't save her. Because her initials were on 400 of the flags. And then Earl Crane spoke. From the center of the floor, in his barn clothes. Because he'd worn them on purpose again. I'm not going to give a speech. My wife couldn't stand them. A small sound from the room. Not quite a laugh. Mr. Marston wants me to believe this was a misunderstanding because he didn't know who I was. But that's the whole sickness. Right there. It shouldn't have mattered who I was. You don't owe a man courtesy because his name's on the building. You owe it to him because he's a man, standing in front of you, asking you to look at what he brought. The fellow in the bespoke suit and the fellow in the barn clothes, you owe them. The times, same look. My grandmother didn't get that look in 1936. The widow up in the mill town didn't get it last year. 340 people didn't get it. He looked around the marble room his blood had built on the lack of it. I'm not here to burn this house down. I'm here to make it finally be the thing it's had carved over the door for 153 years. Connoisseurship, knowing the true worth of a thing, starting with people. The board offered Earl a quiet resolution. He'd take times dawn, times home. The firm would issue a private apology, sign a confidentiality agreement, and acknowledge the historical sensitivity of the Dusk acquisition in a footnote. Earl had Ravel read it twice. Then he sent back one page. Not a counteroffer. A list. He struck the confidentiality clause first, hard enough to tear the paper. Is greater than. There will be no confidentiality clause. My grandmother was struck out of a Bible and called the rural branch and told to keep quiet. And her quiet is exactly what let this run for 90 years. We are done being quiet. Instead, Die-U-E. The hollow at dusk goes home to Slate Hollow, and its true provenance is told the date. The $40, the winter, the widow, by name, Iva Vane Crane. The hollow at dawn goes home beside it. The pair hang together. In the hollow they were painted in, where any child can see them free. A house this size does not need a stolen sunrise to be great. Die-U. The BF and ME desk is abolished today, and every one of the 340 people it flagged is found while they're alive and paid the difference between what this house gave them and what it got. Out of the firm's reserves, not its insurance. If it takes the spring sale, it takes the spring sale. Call it the Iva Crane Fund. Die-U. Sen. Every appraisal this house gives, from now on, is written down, posted, and the same for the man in the barn clothes as the man off the jet. No discretionary lowball. No reading the room before the paper. The paper first. Always the paper first. Die-U. Si. Afa Brennan saw a $30 million painting in a feed sack when 30 years of judgment in a three-piece suit saw a flea market and got called unstable for it. She runs the New Provenance and Fair Dealing desk. Off probation, and Margaret Holloway trains her before she retires. Because Margaret finally opened the drawer, and Sal Petrie's name goes on a plaque by those two paintings, because he was in the truck. And he told the truth at 84, when nobody else in this house would. Die-U. Woo. Daniel Ho. The young man who walked me out and couldn't look at me while he did it and told me on the steps he knew I wasn't casing anything. He gets a place doing the real work, if he wants it. A man who feels the splinter is worth more than 10 who never do. Die-U. Liu. Hugh Marston and the rest are not to be pursued by me or anyone speaking for me. They have their own emails and their own mirrors. And the state can do what the state does. I have no interest in them. I never wanted to own this house. I wanted to bring a painting home and see how a plain man gets treated. And now I know. And now it changes. I'd rather spend what's left, putting my grandmother's name where it belongs, than one more minute on the man who pointed at my boots. Is greater than Earl Vane Crane. The board adopted all 6 within the week. The criminal and regulatory pieces moved on their own gravity after that. The state's financial fraud unit charged the corporate entity and 2 officers. The House entered a consent decree, paid the largest consumer fraud penalty against an auction firm in the state's history and accepted an independent monitor for 5 years. Hugh Marston was barred from the licensed appraisal business for life and pleaded to fraud counts tied to the Times BF Times desk. His sentence was modest. The disgrace was not. Cressida Bain was barred and convicted as an accessory. Trevor Pyle, the fixer, lost his retainer and his license to the bar's ethics committee over the demand that Earl surrender the stolen painting to the firm's own examiner. But Earl didn't want a fine. The way Malcolm before him didn't want a fine. He wanted a Times structure. The Iva Crane Fund found 290 of the 340 flagged consignors within a year and paid them the Milltown widow first. $306,000 and a letter Earl wrote by hand. And the legislature, with the case on every front page, passed the Consignor Fair Dealing Act, requiring licensed art and estate dealers to provide written, uniform valuations, to disclose resale within 2 years to the original consignor, and to report outright purchases above a threshold to a state board. In the trade, nobody calls it that. They call it the Crane Standard. 1 year later, on a Tuesday in March, 2 paintings hang side by side in a small stone building Earl had raised at the head of Slate Hollow, not a museum. Exactly. He calls it the schoolhouse. Because the old schoolhouse used to stand there. The hollow at dawn times and times. The hollow at dusk. The pair. Reunited and home. In the hollow they were painted in. Facing the window that looks out on the actual bend of creek in the canvas. There's no admission. There's a plaque between them. It reads, "The Hollow at Dawn and the Hollow at Dusk," by Avery Cole. 1889. Painted here. Given to the Crane family, who boarded the artist. In February 1936, Iva Vane Crane sold Dusk for $40 to keep her child alive through the winter, and hid Dawn under the smokehouse floor for 60 years, so the pair could one day come home. They have... Sal Petrie carried them both. 1,936 and 2,024. Say their names. Eva. Sal. The rural branch. Sal Petrie read it from a folding chair at the dedication. He's 85 now. He put his old hand flat on the cold wall under the plaque. The hands that carried both paintings 68 years apart. And he asked Earl the only thing there was to ask. Your grandmother, did she ever know it'd come home? That somebody'd finally tell it? And Earl Crane, 68, looked at the 2 paintings, not at the wall. At times, them times, and said, quiet, no. She thought it'd stay under the floor forever. She told me, never sell it cheap and never forget what it is. And I figured that was the whole job. The keeping and the remembering. He touched the frame of Time's Dawn, but she had it backwards. Same as that fella in the suit, just from the other side. She thought the painting was the treasure. It wasn't. The treasure was that she didn't let the cold make her cruel. Her own daddy offered her $40 over a baby's blue lips. And she could have spent the next 60 years hard about it. And instead she raised my daddy gentle, and she raised me gentle, and she made me promise to bring the pair home. Not to get even. He looked at Sal. Getting even's easy. I owned the building. I could have burned it down by noon. She wanted it brought Times home. That's a different thing. That's the harder thing. That's the only thing worth the 4-hour drive. He stepped back. And then he did the last thing. He folded the feed sack the Dawn Times came down the mountain in. His grandmother's kind of sack into a small square, and he set it on the windowsill under the 2 paintings, where the light comes in over the real hollow at dawn. And he left it there. Because some things you keep so you remember what the treasure was wrapped in. Real talk. This part got me. Earl owned the place. 61%. He could have fired every soul in that building before lunch and slept fine. And the thing he wanted, the only thing, was to hang 2 paintings in a hollow and put his grandmother's name on a wall. Not the money. Not the man's head on a plate. He gave away the spring sale to pay back strangers. His grandmother got robbed over a baby's blue lips, and she still raised her boys gentle. And the grandson of that gentleness ended up holding the whole house in his hand and used it to bring a painting home. And Afe Brennan, 26. On a visa. On probation. With a man who signs her contract, telling her to sit down, said, "Times that's a coal," times out loud to the one person in the building who could end her. Because she'd rather be right and unemployed than safe and lying. 153 years of robbery cracked open, partly because a kid wouldn't take it back. That's the part that doesn't make the plaque. It didn't start at that preview. And it won't end with a consent decree. Somewhere today, a plain person is setting something down on a counter, a folder, a feed sack, a painting, a life in front of somebody who's decided, in 3 seconds, off the shoes and the accent and the dirt under the nails, that this one doesn't belong, doesn't know what they have, can be read off the room before anybody reads the paper. And more often than the well-dressed and certain will ever guess. The person they're looking down on owns the floor they're standing on, or built it, or is simply, plainly, owed the same look as anyone, which was always the whole point, and never depended on the shares at all. Read the paper before you read the room, and read the person before you read either. If you've ever been measured by your boots in a room your own people built, drop 1 word in the comments. We'll know what it means. And if this one moved you, send it to somebody who needs it. Her name was Iva Vane. It's on the wall now, in the hollow, where it was always from. Say it.